dress live on your Pinterest For You page and perhaps also your mind rent-free? Same. Then perhaps you have also thought, why don't I just buy it? It can't be that much. Anyways, so I made it instead. In fact, I made a very thorough pattern as well as a test dress, a muslin out of my grandma's old duvet cover. Like seriously old. It was around when my dad was a child, which wasn't exactly yesterday. I mean, obviously. So for this video, I tried to make it as simple as possible, and I just want to say that wherever you are in your sewing skills, I do believe that you can make this. It may seem like a lot of steps, but really there are only 4 pattern pieces. Well, front and back, so really it's 8.
It was all a lie.
And a lot of the sewing steps are just doing the same thing over and over again. I did this in 4 days with a lot of breaks, and most of the time moving the camera and the light takes more time than the actual sewing. If you get stuck somewhere, just try something out, and I do recommend that you also make a test dress, a muslin out of a duvet cover twice as old as you. If you are like 100, please don't do this. That would belong in a museum. So without further ado, let's make a dress. Preferably this one. What you will need. Dress materials. A light/medium weight woven cotton fabric. I wanted a pretty crisp fabric because I like how it looks gathered. If you have a nice quality duvet cover or maybe even bedsheet that hasn't been too worn out, you can use this and be super sustainable, but unfortunately I did not. You will need an invisible zipper. Mine was 30 centimeters and this is very much the medium, okay? The longer the better. What I like least about this dress is the fact that I have to half dislocate my shoulder every time I put it on. We are going to place this in the side seam where it will be most invisible and also won't disrupt the elastic at the top of the dress. Some thread to match your fabric. You definitely don't need one this chunky. This is actually for a serger, but with Wendy said I could, so I will. Some skinny elastic. Mine was 6 millimeters wide. Some pattern paper. Now some other less obvious things you may need but are not entirely dependent on. So as mentioned, we will be making 4 pattern pieces, or maybe 8. They will look a little something like this. Before we can get to drafting our patterns, we need to take some measurements. Over to me. Starting off with our bodice, I'm measuring my desired width, and I think I want to start here-ish at the beginning of my very much non-existent cleavage, and I want it to end kind of right below the boob with a little space between, kind of like a I'm this close to losing it space. So somewhere here, and that would be 15 centimeters. Next, I'm measuring the length of the bottom, trying to keep it straight all the way around. That would be about 74-75 centimeters. Last measurement for the bodice is of the armhole, and since the sleeve will cling onto my shoulder kind of like this, the armhole will start somewhere here, and there's kind of like a little nook here where the shoulder kind of starts, and you can start measuring from here. It doesn't have to be too specific. Now, who likes having sweaty pits, right? Actually, a lot of people from my old high school. Anyway, so I like having armholes that are pretty deep, kind of like somewhere around here. So starting from the nook, I'm measuring it kind of sloped like this. So I'll just measure to somewhere around here. And that would be 16 or 17 centimeters. Again, this is up to you. On my other dress, I had a pretty normal situated armhole and it looked very neat, but I'm now wearing the dress that I made before, and I just wanted to show off that the armhole starts here, so you can start measuring from the nook that I was talking about, kind of here where the shoulder starts. So this is the armhole. It's a couple of centimeters beneath the armpit, but it's still pretty warm, so I wanted to make it a little bit lower. Moving on to the sleeve, I will measure the desired width of the sleeve. So starting on top of my shoulder like this, if you can see, and I want a pretty small sleeve, so somewhere around here, so that would be 15 centimeters. There, it's kind of like here, but again, this is up to you and you can really do however long a sleeve you want. Next, I will measure the length around my arm. That would be 27 centimeters for me. Now to the waist piece, I will measure the width of the waist, and starting off by the bottom of the bodice, and I want mine to end a couple of centimeters above the navel, maybe 2 or 3, so that would be about 10 or 9. Then I'll measure my waist here. And for me, that's about 68 or 69 centimeters. Lastly, we'll measure the desired length of the skirt. We'll start measuring from the bottom of the waist piece down to our desired length. And I want my skirt pretty long so I can slap people's ankles if they don't keep their distance. Social distance. Yeah, I'll definitely stop doing it once this pandemic is over. So it's kind of difficult to see, but I think I see 80 centimeters. So now we're finally done with our measuring and we can move on to making the pattern. First, draw 2 straight lines at a 90-degree angle. If you don't have a ruler like this one, you can start off the angle by the edge of your regular ruler and then extend the line. Or perhaps you can find a good 90-degree object somewhere around the house. I'm thinking books, I'm thinking picture frames. Now on the vertical line, measure and mark your desired width of the bodice that we measured. This side right here, no, left here, will be put on the fold of the fabric when cutting it out so that we get a whole front bodice piece. You can now proceed to add 90-degree lines to all sides, almost making a rectangle. The opposite side of the fold is where the sleeve will be, and we don't need to make this side as long. For reference, this is my other pattern that I made with a regular sized armhole. Now, I measured the size of the armhole, aka the measurement we took that was probably most confusing, starting somewhere on the line here and going up a little bit inwards so that we can shape a nice sloped armhole. You can either decide how long you want the side seam of your bodice to be, or you can decide how you want to shape the armhole and neckline and just let the measurement that we took land somewhere on the line, and that will be how long the side will be. Importantly, the side needs to have room for the beginning of the zipper. You don't want your zipper to be in the armhole, so I would say you need a side piece of at least 4 centimeters. You can definitely have a longer side. I wanted to start the armhole as low as possible because I didn't want to extend the top of the bodice too much on the side because I wanted a very square neckline. I did end up having to extend it a bit at the side of the top just to make the armhole as large as I had decided when measuring, but the neckline still ended up pretty square. Now you can spend some time shaping the armhole and neckline. I tried to somewhat replicate the shapes of that first dress I made. Lastly, I added 1.5 centimeters to the top of the neckline, and this is for the channel to put elastic in. It's including seam allowance just to make things simpler. Back bodice is basically the front bodice but mirrored. The side to be cut on the fold is now the opposite. What we have to decide now is to either make it the same width as the front piece or shorter. The important thing is that our side seam opposite side to the front has to be the same length as that of the front bodice, because they'll be sewn together here and must match up. Since I made my back piece less wide than my front, I also made the armhole a bit shorter. Now moving on to the sleeve, draw one straight horizontal line and then a 90-degree vertical line and put it somewhat in the middle of that horizontal line. Just measured our desired length around the bottom of the sleeve, the arm measurement times 2 plus 20 for me, it's however big you want, and forgot to center the center line. So then I marked the desired width of my sleeve on that vertical line. I drew a little arrow on this line, not because I will cut it out on the fold this time, but because when cutting out the sleeve piece, this line should be aligned with the fabric's grain line. Then you draw another straight horizontal line parallel to the first one, going through the width of our sleeve measurement, 15 centimeters for me. Then from our mark on the bottom horizontal line, we are going to measure straight up a couple of centimeters. This is because the side of the sleeve needs to be shorter than the middle so that they end up on a similar level around the arm. Then drew the rounded bottom of the sleeve to see how it looked, and I decided to try this out. It may be difficult to know exactly how much shorter it needs to be, so I just started out with 5 centimeters. I also measured 4.2 centimeters up from that 5 centimeter mark at a somewhat 90-degree angle with the bottom of the sleeve we just drew. The 4.2 is the inner length of our sleeve. Yes, 4.2 centimeters was also the measurement of the side of my bodice pieces. It does not at all have to be the same. I just wanted to see what it would look like, and I wanted a very short sleeve. Then to make the front part of the armhole, I measured the same measurement as on our front bodice, starting from our 4.2 mark, and while a bit shaped, let it land somewhere near our other horizontal line. Then start to shape the sloped armhole and top of the sleeve. I decided to make the top of the sleeve as straight as possible simply because I thought it would look better and make it easier to make our channel for the elastic. Then did the same for the back, except this time measuring the same as on our back bodice. For me, 14 centimeters. I then, like with the bodice, added the extra 1.5 centimeter for the channel. Finished with the sleeve, we move on to greater things. Or smaller things, the waist piece. Okay, another 90-degree angle where you mark the two measurements we took for our waist. Don't forget, like I did, our biggest measurement, presumably beneath the chest, should be the measurement of our horizontal line, and if you measured your waist measurement, this should be in the middle of the width, aka the side. I would maybe make my waist piece a bit bigger because it's a lot easier taking it in a bit later on than getting rib removal surgery, and started shaping the side like a waist. And then I made the back piece the same way, only the fold is now on the opposite side. Finally, to the skirt, draw a long straight line and mark your desired skirt length. From this line, draw two vertical lines and here mark our desired width of the skirt. Then make a rectangle by drawing another horizontal line. I then added 10 centimeters to the bottom horizontal line, the bottom of our skirt, because I'm making it flare out in the side. I hope that's the proper term, like go out in the side and grow wider towards the bottom. Then I started rounding it from somewhat the middle of the skirt. You could decide how much shorter you want it in the side and round it from here, but I just rounded it kind of how I wanted and then measured in order to do the same to the back skirt. It ended up being 4 centimeters shorter. To not make it much shorter on the side, I added 2 centimeters at the top of the same side. I then slightly shaped the top. I went back after this and made it more straight. Just looking at this, it would probably look very weird. I then made the back exactly the same but mirrored. We are done drafting our pattern pieces and I was very tired at this point, mainly in my head, and so I did the only thing you can do to get back some energy and will: mini golfing. Unfortunately, since I was so tired, and only because I was so tired, I was not on my regular A game or even occasional B game, but suddenly it came back and then immediately vanished. We're not quite finished with our pattern. We have to add seam allowances, but first we have to check our pattern, which basically means checking that our patterns fit together and that the seams are of the same length and shape. And it can really save you from making a big blunder mistake or a lot of little ones. And it can also save you time and fabric because it will be trickier correcting your mistakes after you cut them out on your fabric. So, to check our pattern, we are going to align the pieces that are going to be sewn together. All three front and back pieces down the side seam. My bodice pieces were of the same length in the side, but I wanted to kind of soften the shape in the armhole. And to take the sleeve and bodice pieces together, I put the bodice piece facing down on top of the sleeve piece. Think right sides together here. And starting from the side seam, walked the bodice piece along the armhole of the sleeve. I did this by holding it in place with my finger and twisting it so that the two lines were always touching the entire walk up. To be more precise, and it might be easier to see, you can use a pin when holding in place and twisting. You would also need something underneath to push the pin into to prevent making little holes in a perfectly good table. If you have a perfectly bad table, go ahead. Mine were not entirely aligned at the top, so I drew the lines of my sleeve onto my bodice piece. Of course, this was on the wrong side, so I had to flip it over and fill it in. Then I folded it in half to check if the sides of my sleeve were the same length, and it was then I realized the center line was not doing its job properly. Then I immediately replaced it with an actual centered line. Then check the sides as well as the bottom of the sleeve. They do not have to be the exact same, you just want a similar shape. Then I checked the side seam of the waist pieces by flipping one of the pieces over. Again, think right sides together. Finally, I checked that the sides of front and back skirt were the same length as well as a similar shape at the bottom. Lastly, before moving on to fabric, we're going to add seam allowances. I want 1.2 centimeters where the two fabrics of a seam are serged together, 1.5 where the seam is pressed open, and each side is serged individually. Now, something that I discovered, of course after adding all the seam allowances and cutting it out on the fabric, was that my fabric was pretty see-through when pressed onto my body. Since my waist piece this very much became my second skin. That's how tight it is. It was very see-through here, and I did not like the look of the serged edges being so visible, so instead I decided to serge the seam together and press it upwards into the bodice and downwards into the skirt. So if you have a fabric that is relatively see-through like mine, I would add 1.2 centimeters instead of 1.5, as you will unfortunately have to watch me do in the following clips. 1.5 centimeters at the bottom of the sleeve to make the same channel. 1 centimeter at the bottom of the skirt for a nice rolled hem. I then cut all the pieces out outside the seam allowances in case anyone was wondering, not because I doubt your intelligence or anything. Speaking of intelligence, I had at this point once again lost all my brain juice, and what's the only thing that can fix that? That's right, mini golfing. No, this is not the same day. We really voluntarily went miniature golfing 2 days in a row. Then it was time to cut out all pattern pieces on the fabric. If possible, cut to minimize the waste. But don't forget to align the arrows we've drawn with the grain line of the fabric. Also, you should mark what is a front and what is a back piece. I suggest using an actual fabric marker that goes away when washed or brushed off. The sleeve is not cut on a fold, but on a folded fabric so that we get 2 sleeves. Remember that the pieces should be mirrored when the right side is facing up, and when marking F for front, it will be on the left for our left sleeve and the right for our right sleeve. Now that that's done, before jumping straight into making this thing, it could be wise to get some air, clear your head, and watch the day you've been robbed of because you've been stuck inside all day losing brain cells over this tutorial. Just wither away. Okay, now we're finally ready to make this thing. So we've got our 3 or 6 body pieces, and first off we're going to sew front and back pieces together down one side. It's important that it's the same side because this will be on the non-zipper side. So now is the time to choose which side if you have a preference. We can also sew the side seams of our 2 sleeves, though we'll get to the sleeves later. Now before moving on to the next step, we naturally have to press the seams as well as serge or finish off the edges. Now for the people who do not own a serger, as long as you zigzag your edges, it will do a good job of preventing fraying of your fabric. So then we serge or zigzag all our seam allowances and press them open. Moving on to the next step, which is gathering. You're going to sew 2 parallel straight stitches without any back stitching at the beginning or end. Also, you want to make the stitch length as long as you can on your machine. I like to place my stitches on either side of our seam line. Now, to gather, we pick up our 2 top threads and pull. Not too hard, but honestly, who's got the time? You don't really have to be gentle. So then the fabric is scrunched up or gathered, because that's the name, and you can push it back to gather more fabric. Now in order to know how much we need to gather, place the waist piece underneath and gather until they seem to be of the same length. So then when the bodice and waist look even, pin them right sides together at the side seam and then the other side as well. And try to spread the gathering evenly and pin along the way. It's difficult to gather perfectly even. You will just have to settle after a while because you can be at it all day or all year if you like, and in the end it might not even look better than when you started. You can flip it over to the right side to kind of see how it will look, then do the same thing for the back piece. So then you sew the gathering in place using a regular straight stitch. If you did it right, you should sew in between the 2 stitches, but what's most important is that you follow your seam allowance. Now repeat the exact same process for the skirt piece. So we kind of have a dress now, or a weird blanket. Anyways, I think we deserve a little break before moving on to the zipper. I went to a castle, which really is not as cool as it sounds. Funny how any giant old building that once housed a distant relative to the king is now called a castle. Actually, I don't know who lived here, but the giant yard outside and the carrot cake was pretty nice. Okay, back to work. First off, we want to serge and press our edges. This time we serge the 2 layers together. Then press the top seam upwards towards the bodice and the bottom downwards towards the skirt. Next we pin the other side seam, making sure all the seams match up. So then I marked the beginning of my zipper on the side seam, starting 2 centimeters down. You can start wherever you want, but I think it looks the best the closer to the armhole you are. 1.2 centimeters of those 2 centimeters is the seam allowance of the armhole. Then I marked 3 centimeters above where the end of the zipper would be. Now, when sewing the side seam, starting off at the top in the armhole, once we get to the first mark, backstitch properly, then change the stitch length from regular to the longest one on your machine, then sew to the other mark, backstitch again, and then change back to your regular stitch length for the rest of the skirt down. We press the seams open and serge the seam allowances. I also iron the zipper teeth down flat as it will make it much easier to sew as close to the zipper teeth as possible. I seam rip the long stitches between the 2 marks. What you see here pressed outwards is the right side of the fabric, and we are going to place the zipper onto it facing down. Then you pin so that the zipper teeth are just sticking out over the fold of that pressed edge. Make sure you don't pin into the 2 layers of that fold and just the top one. It's most important to make sure that the front and back waist seams match up when the zipper is closed. You may have to re-pin a bunch of times until you get it perfectly right. Trust me, it's really worth it. Now that's in place, you can either sew it down with the pins in, or you can be extra like me and make a few basting stitches by hand. I chose a contrasting color to show you, but if you choose a thread that blends in well, you won't have to seam rip it later on. Then I recommend you use the zipper foot if you have one, though mine isn't very optimal for getting as close as possible. If you press it open neatly like I showed you before, I think maybe you could use a regular presser foot and sew while staying slightly on top of the zipper with the foot, not the needle. So then I just sewed and took it pretty slow to really make sure I'm so close I'm almost, but not really, sewing into the teeth. Once you get past the lower mark, you don't have to sew that close anymore, and you just have to make sure you sew the tape in place. This is because the zipper teeth will from here on disappear into the seam. And for a little break here, we have me and my family doing the most Swedish thing you're probably likely to see today, playing Kubb in the Rain, classic Swedish summer. And no, that's not my parents winning the game, okay, so it is, but you know what, my sister is a huge liability, so speaking of so, but with an E and a W, back to work. Our next step is attaching the sleeves, so right sides together, matching the front of the sleeve with the front bodice and back to the back. Now pin, starting off by matching up the side seams, then the outer corners front and back, and then stretching and fitting while pinning along the way. Then sew it in place. This is how it turned out by the zipper to the serger. Hi, okay, so I already put the sleeves on and everything, haven't gathered yet. I just wanted to show what the zipper looks like on. I also just want to show you the length of the skirt. Moving straight ahead to making our channel, fold in 5mm and pin without overdoing it. Alternatively, you can iron this down, but I find this is the easiest for me, and I sew all this down with the longest straight stitch to save some time. Fold it over once again, this time 1 centimeter. I fold on the wrong side of the fabric in order to measure, but I pin so that the pins are on the right side of the fabric where we're going to sew. Then to make feeding the elastic through a bit easier, I would cut off as much fabric I can where we have the seams of the shoulder, as it can get very bulky. Then I sew that down, starting right after a shoulder seam where it will be best to leave our little opening for the elastic. Try to sew as close to the edge as possible without accidentally sewing outside it. So once you've sewn all the way around and get close to where you started your stitch, you leave 2 or 3 centimeters and backstitch. Then I repeated those steps at the bottom of my sleeves. To insert the elastic, I attached a safety pin to the end and fed it through the opening, and kept feeding it for a very long time until it was very gathered. Then using another bundle of the same elastic that I luckily had, I did the same thing to one sleeve, and then it was time to try it on and fit to my liking. Okay, so we have finally arrived and we have a dress. Well, sort of. Please don't look at this. Okay, so we have elastic in our dress. We just want to get rid of these. So what we do now is adjust and gather until it sits right, holds everything in place. It's flash proof. But obviously if you have bigger boobs than me, which is not that big, it might be more difficult. Then when we're happy with the gathering, we put the safety pin into the beginning of the loop. When happy, cut the ends off. Don't forget to add about 1 cm seam allowance and then zigzag the elastic shut. Importantly, before you do this, make sure that the elastic hasn't been twisted anywhere because later on it will be very much too late. I mean, it's not too late, but you know. Then lastly, you need to go back to the stitch of the 3 channels and jump right back in and sew them shut. For our final step, we are going to hem this piece of sheet, which I'm going to lazily just fold over twice, about 5 mm each time, and then sew it down as close to the edge as possible, and voila, you have a nice doubled hem and hopefully a very nice dress.
Are we done? No.
Yes, we are. Okay, photo shoot time.
What's that?
Ja.